Good morning. Today we are going to read chapters 14 and 15 and take a look at the discussion questions below that go with it, and then go on to Schoology and take the 12 through 15 quiz. So hopefully we're going to finish this book up probably by Monday and do some fun activities with it, and then we'll move on to something different. All right, so let's take a look. There's a fair amount of vocabulary. Let's share the screen. Okay, so chapter 13 vocab. So we're gonna go through all of it. I guess I didn't do the vocab for chapter 13 the other day, so we'll have just a couple more. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned their sweaters, jackets, and coats. So when you use some context clues with this sentence, what do you do with a sweater, jacket, and a coat? What do people do with it? They weren't hanging them up. It could have been. But you ever think of the Christmas carol, Domino, our gay apparel? Donned means you would substitute in there maybe to put on. Oops. Sorry, guys. Yep, to put on an item of clothing. The local doctor was an old man, brusque and businesslike. So brusque is a great vocabulary word to describe somebody. If somebody's brusque, they're all business. They don't have a lot of time for, small chit chat. They're all like, they say things like, oh, they'll just give me that. Time to go. Get your coat. This, all very kind of businesslike. So that's a nice example of how they can have in the sentence a synonym to help you along. Very abrupt and blunt in speech or manner. So the opposite of somebody who is brusque might be like, oh, I'm so sorry you don't feel well. Let me, please help me understand. And somebody who's brusque would say, what's wrong with you? Kind of deal. Anne-Marie always tried to prolong this part to build up the suspense and tantalize her sister. We had this word before. I think we likened it and we talked about eating an ice cream. And, it was for savor. It was for the word savor. So savor is when you do something really, so prolong means to make long. And I know you know that word, but tantalize is like, oh, don't you wish you could have this? Or if I'm telling you a story, I want to build up suspense. I want you on your seat just listening. So to tease someone with the promise of something to come that is often unattainable. Ooh, that's a great word. Kind of a mean thing to do then, if you think about it that way, because it's unattainable. Don't you wish you had one of these? Maybe you can get it. Kind of feeling when you tantalize somebody. With the soldiers straining at taut leashes, straining at taut leashes were two large dogs. So if a dog is straining at a leash, think about what that leash looks like. It would be really taut. So another word for that would be stretched or pulled tight. Anne-Marie gave him a withering look. You know we have no meat, she said insolently. That sounds like something if you were talking to a Nazi soldier and they were like, what, no meat? She's like, you know we have no meat. Would they think that was a proper response, or would they think that she was speaking insolently? So it's not a positive word. If you spoke insolently to me in class, you'd probably get reprimanded, all right? So you can't speak to me like that. It's rude, arrogant, or disrespectful. So something you could say insolently to me. I don't understand why we have to do that. I think it's stupid. Would be something insolent. Please, please, she implored in her mind, don't lift the napkin. We've had this word and talked about it a bunch of times. It's another great word instead of saying she said. It's to beg someone desperately. So, oh gosh, I wish, I want. You're imploring, you're begging, pleading. Your uncle has a pretty little lunch, the soldier said scornfully. Your uncle has a pretty little lunch. It says a Nazi soldier. We know that whatever this word scornfully means, it's not going to be positive. Scornfully means to look down on with hatred or disdain. So the root word there is scorn. And if you have scorn, you really despise somebody and just think they're horrible people. So if you have scorn for someone, so when you say something scornfully, you're saying it with this like, ugh, I do not like this or you. Some of the boat engines were starting their strident din. That's a tough one. If I were to try to figure out the meaning of that, I might relate it to something else I know. And I think about, and I could be wrong on this, my mythology people might know better, but what do the gods hold? Is that a strident? Strident means loud or harsh. So I don't know, I might use stride. That's a tough one. There's not a lot of context clues there. But in this instant, it means loud or harsh. And din means a loud or unpleasant, prolonged noise. So I guess there are good root words in there. In hindsight, thinking, what does an engine sound like when it starts on? Especially in the 1940s, they probably weren't known to be quiet. And that should be it for those vocab. So let's go ahead and go back to the story. On the dark path. Only now, entering the woods in the footpath, did Anne-Marie realize how cold the dawn was. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned sweaters, jackets, and coats, and she had peered into the night, following them with her eyes, as they moved silently off, bulky in their garments, blankets in their arms. But she wore only a light sweater over her cotton dress. Though the October day would be warmed by sunlight, now it was gray, chilly, and damp. She shivered. The path curved, and she could no longer look behind her and see the clearing with the farmhouse outlined against the pale sky in the lightning meadow beyond. Now there were only the dark woods ahead. Underfoot, the path, latticed with thick roots hidden under the fallen leaves, was invisible. She felt her way with her feet, trying not to stumble. The handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through her sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had told often to Kirsty as they cuddled in bed at night. Once upon a time, there was a girl, she told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. Her mother had made it for her. She wore it so often that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. Kirsty would always interrupt there. Why was it called a Red Riding Hood? Kirsty would ask. Why didn't they just call her Little Red Cloak? Well, it had a hood that covered her head, and she had beautiful curls like you, Kirsty. Maybe someday Mama will make you a coat with a hood to cover your curls and keep you warm. But why, Kirsty would ask. Why was it a riding hood? Was she riding a horse? Maybe she had a horse that she rode sometimes, but not in this story. Now stop interrupting every minute. Anne-Marie smiled, feeling her way through the dark, remembering how Kirsty always interrupted stories to ask questions. Often she just wanted to make the story last longer. So she's kind of, if you're scared of something, you try to play something happy or a different thought in your head instead of ruminating on that thought, instead of just focusing on that idea. The story continued. One day, little girl's mother said, I want you to take a basket of food to your grandmother. She is sick in bed. Come, let me tie your red cloak. The grandmother lived deep in the woods, didn't she? Kirsty would ask, in the dangerous wolves where the wolves lived. Anne-Marie heard a small noise, a squirrel perhaps, or a rabbit scampering by. She paused, stood still on the path, and smiled again. Kirsty would have been frightened. She would have grabbed Anne-Marie's hand and said, a wolf. But Anne-Marie knew that these woods were not like the woods in the story. There were no wolves or bears or tigers, none of the beasts that populated Kirsty's vivid imagination. She hurried on. Still, they were very dark, these woods. Anne-Marie had never followed this path in the dark before, had told her mother she would run, and she tried. Here the path turned. She knew the turning well, though it seemed different in the dark. If she turned to the left, it would take her to the road, out where it would be lighter, wider, more traveled, but more dangerous too. Someone could see her on the road. At this time of the dawn, other fishermen would be on the road, hurrying to their boats for the long day at sea, and they might be soldiers. She turned to the right and headed deeper into the woods. It was why Mama and Peter had needed to guide those who were strangers here, the Rosens and the others. A wrong turn would have taken them into danger. So Little Red Riding Hood carried the basket of food and hurried along through the woods. It was a lovely morning and birds were singing. Little Red Riding Hood sang too as she walked. Sometimes she changed that part of the story, telling it to Kirsty. Sometimes it was raining or even snowing in the woods. Sometimes it was evening with long, frightening shadows so that Kirsty, listening, would snuggle closer and wrap her arms around Anne-Marie. But now, telling it to herself, she wanted sunlight and birdsong. Here the path widened and flattened. It was the place where the woods opened on one side and the path curved beside a meadow at the edge of a sea. Here she could run, and she did. Here in the daylight there would be cows in the meadow, and on summer afternoons Anne-Marie would always stop by the fence and hold out handfuls of grass, which the curious cows would take with their rough tongues. Here her mother had told her Mama would always stop too, as a child walking to school. Her dog Trofast would wriggle under the fence and run about in the meadow, barking excitedly, trying to chase the cows who always ignored him. The meadow was empty now and colorless in the half-light. She could hear the churning sea beyond and see the wash of daylight to the east over Sweden. She ran as fast as she could, searching with her eyes for the place where the path would re-enter the woods in its final segment, which led to town. Here. The bushes were overgrown and it was difficult to see the path here, but she found the entrance, beside the high blueberry bushes. How often she had stopped here in late summer to pick up handfuls of the sweet berries. Her hands and mouth would be blue afterwards. Mama always laughed when she came home. Now it was dark again as the trees and bushes closed around her, and she had to move more slowly, though she still tried to run. Anne-Marie thought of Mama, her ankle so swollen and her face so pained. She hoped Mama had called the doctor by now. The local doctor was an old man, brusque and businesslike, though with kind eyes. He'd come to the farmhouse several times during the summers of the past. His battered car noisy on the dirt road. He had come once when Kirsty, a tiny baby then, had been sick and wailing with an earache. And he had come when Lise had spilled hot grease, cooking breakfast, and burned her hand. Anne-Marie turned again as the path divided once more. The left fork would take her directly to the village. It was the way they had come from the train, and the way Mama had walked to school as a girl. But Anne-Marie turned to the right, heading now toward the harbor side where the fishing boats lay at anchor. She had often come this way before too, sometimes at the end of the afternoon, to pick out the Inchborg, Uncle Henrik's boat, from the many returning, and to watch him and his helpers unload the day's catch of slippery, shimmering herring still flopping in their containers. Even now, with the boats in the harbor ahead, empty of fish, preparing to leave for the day's fishing, she could smell the oily, salty scent of herring, which always remained in the air here. It wasn't far now, and it was getting lighter. She ran almost as fast as she had run at school in the Friday foot races, almost as fast as she had run down the Copenhagen sidewalk on the day that the soldier had stopped her with his call of "Halt!" Anne-Marie continued the story in her head. Suddenly, as Little Red Riding Hood walked through the woods, she heard a noise. She heard a rustling in the bushes. "A wolf," Kirsty would always say, shivering with fearful delight. "I know it's going to be the wolf." Anne-Marie always tried to prolong this part to build up the suspense and tantalize her sister. She didn't know what it was. She stopped on the path and listened. Something was following her in the bushes. Little Red Riding Hood was very, very, very frightened. She would stop, would stay silent for a moment, and beside her in the bed, she could feel Kirsty holding her breath. Then Anne-Marie would go in a low, dreadful voice. She heard a growl. Anne-Marie stopped suddenly and stood still on the path. There was a turn immediately ahead. Beyond it, she knew, as soon as she rounded the turn, she would see the landscape open to the sea. The woods would be behind her there, and ahead of her would be the harbor, the docks, and the countless fishing boats. Very soon it would be noisy there, with engines starting, fishermen calling to one another, and gulls crying. But she had heard something else. She heard bushes rustling ahead. She heard footsteps, and she was certain it was not her imagination. She heard a low growl. Cautiously, she took a step forward and another. She approached the turn in the path. The noises continued. Then there they were in front of her. 4 armed soldiers, with them straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glittering, their lips curled. So there she is. She's so close to the boat where Henrik is. And here they are in front of her. So understand the whole time she's telling herself this Little Red Riding Hood story is because she's just trying to get, trying to be brave, trying to get the fear out of her head and shifting it to something else. But here she is now. She's face to face with the soldiers. Chapter 15. My dogs smell meat. Anne-Marie's mind raced. She remembered what her mother had said. If anyone stops you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a silly little girl. She stared at the soldiers. She remembered how she had stared at the others, frightened, when they had stopped her on the street. Kirsty hadn't been frightened. Kirsty had been, well, nothing more than a silly little girl, angered because a soldier had touched her hair that afternoon. She had known nothing of danger, and the soldier had been amused by her. Anne-Marie willed herself with all her being to behave like Kirsty would. Good morning, she said carefully to the soldiers. They looked her up and down in silence. Both dogs were tense and alert. The 2 soldiers who held the leashes wore thick gloves. What are you doing here? One of them asked. Anne-Marie held out her basket with a thick loaf of bread visible. My Uncle Henrik forgot his lunch and I'm taking it to him. He's a fisherman. The soldiers were looking around. Their eyes glanced behind her and scanned the bushes on either side. Are you alone? One asked. Anne-Marie nodded. Yes, she said. One of the dogs growled, but she noticed that both dogs were looking at the lunch basket. One soldier stepped forward, the other, and the 2 holding the dogs remained where they were. You come out before daybreak just to bring lunch? Why doesn't your uncle eat fish? What would Kirsty reply? Anne-Marie tried to giggle, the way her sister might. Uncle Henrik doesn't even like fish, he says, laughing. He says he sees too much of it and smells too much of it. Anyway, he wouldn't eat it raw. She made a face. Well, I suppose he would if he were starving, but Uncle Henrik always has bread and cheese for lunch. Keep chattering, she told herself, as Kirsty would. A silly little girl. I like fish, she went on. I like the way my mother cooks it. Sometimes she rolls it in breadcrumbs and... The soldier reached forward and grabbed the crisp loaf of bread from the basket. He examined it carefully, then broke it in half, pulling the 2 halves apart with his fist. That would enrage Kirsty, she knew. Don't, she said angrily. That's Uncle Henrik's bread. My mother baked it. The soldier ignored her. He tossed the 2 halves of the loaves to the ground, one in front of each dog. They consumed it, each snapping at the bed and gulping it so that it was gone in an instant. Have you seen anyone in the woods? The soldier barked the question at her. No, only you. Anne-Marie stared at him. What are you doing in the woods anyway? You're making me late. Uncle Henrik's boat will leave before I get there with his lunch, or what's left of his lunch. The soldier picked up the wedge of cheese. He turned it over in his hand. He turned it to the 3 behind him and asked them something in their own language. One of the men said, Nein, in a bored tone. Anne-Marie recognized the word the man had replied, no. He had probably been asked, Anne-Marie thought, do you want this? Or perhaps should I give this to the dog? The soldier continued to hold the cheese. He tossed it back and forth between his hands. Anne-Marie gave an exasperated sigh. Could I go now, please? She asked impatiently. The soldier reached for the apple. He noted its brown spots and made a face of disgust. No meat? He asked, glancing at the basket and the napkin that lay in its bottom. Anne-Marie gave him a withering look. You know we have no meat, she said insolently. Your army eats all of Denmark's meat. Please, please, she implored in her mind, don't lift the napkin. The soldiers laughed. He dropped the bruised apple on the ground. One of the dogs leaned forward, pulling at his leaf, sniffed the apple, and stepped back. But both dogs still looked intently at the basket, their ears alert, their mouths open, saliva glistening on their smooth pink gums. My dogs smell meat, the soldier said. They smell squirrels in the woods, Anne-Marie responded. You should take them hunting. The soldier reached forward with the cheese in his hand as if he were going to return it to the basket, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the flowered cotton napkin. Anne-Marie froze. Your uncle has a pretty little lunch, the soldier said scornfully, crumbling the napkin around the cheese in his hand. Like a woman, he said he added with contempt. Then his eyes locked on the basket. He handed the cheese and napkin to the soldier beside him. What's in that? There, in the bottom, he asked in a different, tenser tone. What would Kirsty do? Anne-Marie stamped her foot. Suddenly, to her own surprise, she began to cry. I don't know, she said, and her voice choked. My mother's going to be angry you stopped me and made me late, and you completely ruined Uncle Henrik's lunch, so now he'll be mad at me too. The dogs whined and struggled against the leashes, nosing forward to the basket. One of the other soldiers muttered something in German. The soldier took out the packet. Why was this so carefully hidden? He snapped. Anne-Marie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. It wasn't hidden any more than the napkin was. I don't know what it is. That, she realized, was true. She had no idea what was in the packet. The soldier tore the paper open, while below him on the ground, the dogs strained and snarled, pulling at their leashes. Their muscles were visible beneath the sleek, short-haired flesh. He looked inside, then glared at Anne-Marie. Stop crying, you idiot girl, he said harshly. Your stupid mother has sent your uncle a handkerchief. In German, the women have better things to do. They don't stay at home hemming handkerchiefs for their men. He gestured with the folded white cloth and gave it a caustic laugh. At least she didn't stitch flowers on it. He flung it to the ground, still half wrapped in the paper, beside the apple. The dog's lunch sniffed at it eagerly, then subsided, disappointed. Go on, the soldier said. He dropped the cheese and the napkin into her basket. Go on to your uncle and tell him the German dogs enjoyed his bread. All of the soldiers pushed past her. One of them laughed, and they spoke to each other in their own language. In a moment, they had disappeared down the path in the direction from which Anne-Marie had just come. Quickly, she picked up the apple and opened the packet with the white handkerchief. She put them into the basket and ran around the bend toward the harbor, where the morning sky was now bright and the early sun and some of the boat engines were starting on their strident din. The Ingeborg was still there by the dock, and Uncle Henrik was there, his light hair windblown and bright as he knelt by the nets. Anne-Marie called to him, and he came to the side, his face worried when he recognized her on the dock. She handed the basket across. Mama sent your lunch, she said, her voice quavering. But the soldiers stopped her, and they took your bread. She didn't dare tell him more. Uncle Henrik quickly glanced into basket. She could see the look of relief on his face, and she knew that it was because he saw that the packet was there, even though it was torn open. Thank you, he said, and the relief was evident in his voice. Anne-Marie looked quickly around the familiar small boat. She could see down the passageway into the empty cabin. There was no sign of the Rosens or the others. Uncle Henrik followed her eyes and her puzzled look. All is well, he said softly. Don't worry. Everything is all right. I wasn't sure, he said, but now, he eyed the basket in his hands. Because of you, Anne-Marie, everything is all right. You run home now and tell your mama not to worry. I will see you this evening. He grinned at her suddenly. They took my bread, eh? He said. I hope they choke on it. Oof, all right. That was confusing because why in the world is it such an issue to make sure that they had that packet when all that was in it was a napkin? That, if we think about that scene, the dogs were certainly eager to get to. We'll figure that out tomorrow. But that was definitely, if our whole idea and theme of conflict has been having to be brave, then that was probably definitely our climax. That was the moment where she had to be brave and the Rosens had to be safe. And now he's saying everything is okay. We realize we're nearing the very end of the book. So we're going to start piecing the pieces together to understand what just happened there. All right. See you tomorrow.